Yeah. Okay, comrades, welcome to another meeting of the Workers' International Network. It's good to see we have comrades from at least, for my reckoning, at least 7 or 8 countries here already, though it's a small meeting. But once again, we're looking forward to a really unique discussion. We're happy to welcome Comrade Michael Roberts. I think I'd just like to say before Michael starts, I think we'll all agree that history is moving now very fast. The world is hurtling towards a new era, one of outright conflict, repression, and war. The American century is drawing to a close, and the new superpower China is edging towards a position of supremacy. So we're entering into an all-out trade war. What will be the consequences? Will a competitive round of tariffs bring us even faster to an all-out world slump? Will it lead to a sharp rise in inflation? Some economists are arguing that this could actually regenerate the US economy, which will be forced to revive manufacturing investment at home. Will this bring home to the USA third world wages and conditions? If so, and what will be the economic impact if Trump carries through his threat to deport millions of undocumented workers? Hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being invested on the development of the new technology and artificial intelligence. What effect will this have on jobs and wages in USA and worldwide? Will the development of China's new artificial intelligence tool DeepSeek undermine the investment plans of US technology companies? Will Trump's policy of drill baby drill doom any remaining hope of developing alternative energy sources? Obviously, this and a whole range of other questions are actually uppermost in the minds of people all around the world. And I think we're especially privileged to welcome today the leading Marxist economist, Michael Roberts, to guide us through an overview of the crisis and to throw light on all its manifestations. He is, of course, the author of the prestigious website, the Next Recession, and I think there could be no one better to give a clear and comprehensible answer to all of these questions. So over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you, Roger. Your introduction just about covered all the subjects, even partially answered them, I think. So maybe I'm going to be amplifying these points that you've raised in the course of that introduction. So we're talking about the world economy as we enter 2025. So we're well into the 21st century now. And what is the state of the world economy? That's what I'm going to discuss and what the implications are along some of the points that Roger raised in his introduction. To do that, as I usually do, is to present you a presentation with a series of graphics that you can follow. I've actually put the URL or the place where you can look at those presentation graphs afterwards in the chat. So if you get lost, you'll be able to go back and whip through them again if there's any particular graph that you like. So let me just get that into position. Right, so world economy in 2025. Let's start off by looking at the state of the major capitalist economies in the world and how they've done over the last 5 years. So this is a graph which shows the growth in national output per person in each of those 7 countries accumulated over the last 5 years, not per year, but what they've managed to do in raising the level of output per person since 2019 up to 2024. And you can see that on the right-hand side, the US has managed to increase its real GDP per person by just under 10% in 5 years. Now, quick bit of arithmetic will tell you that that's 2% a year. So that is the maximum growth level of the major capitalist economies that comes from the US. If you go to the other end, you can see that Canada has actually not increased its per capita growth rate in the last 5 years. It's actually declined. So the level of output per person being accrued in the Canadian economy is some nearly 3% lower than it was 5 years ago. And that also applies to Germany, the powerhouse of Europe, which has also seen a decline. Here in the UK, well, okay, the UK economy has managed to achieve output per head growth of just over 1% in the last 5 years. Again, if you do a little bit of arithmetic, that means it's been growing at around about 0.2% a year per person. That is really abysmal level of growth. It gives you an indication that basically the top capitalist economies have been virtually stagnating, with the highest growing at just 2% per person and the lowest actually declining. And if we look over the past period of the 21st century, starting more or less at the beginning of that century, you can see on the left-hand side that you have a growth rate trend going from 90 to just over 110, using this line on the left here. That shows if the economy in the US had continued to grow at the rate it was growing before the Great Recession, which was 2008, and there'd been no Great Recession, and it carried on growing, it would have reached here by 2012. But in fact, we had a big global slump. It went down here, and when it reached, it didn't even reach the level that would have reached until well into 2016. And in fact, if you measure it from there, it's a 10% loss in output for the US. Similarly, after the pandemic slump, which is here, the trend growth rate now is much lower. It's not going up there. It's now going along here. That's how much slowdown taken place in the US. Another 2% is lost. So looking at the US, basically, over the whole period from virtually the beginning of this 21st century to now, something like 12% of output has been lost that otherwise would have been achieved if it hadn't been for these two slumps. In the Eurozone, it's worse. They lost 10% in the Great Recession, and they've lost another 4% in the pandemic. So in each decade of this 21st century, the 2000s, the 2010s, and now the 2020s, each decade, there's a slowing rate of growth. So not only have they more or less stagnated in the last 5 years, but the trend growth is getting worse. Things are getting worse. Growth is slowing down in the major capitalist economies. It's particularly the case in Europe. It really has been a disastrous last few years in Europe. If you look at the 1980s, Europe used to grow at around about 1.9% a year and had 25% of the world's output in the 1980s. Then it slowed down to about 1.5% for the last decades of the 1990s and the 2000s, and it gradually lost its share of world output down to 15% in the 2010s. But in the 2020s, of which we've now had 4 years, it's growing at only 1% a year overall in the European economies, averaged out. And now the share of world output that Europe has is less than 15%. So that's a real decline in the position that Europe has in the world economy. And in fact, if we look ahead, we get a position from the World Bank, one of the major international agencies that forecasts what's going to happen in the world economy in terms of output. And they reckon that the global economy now is on track for the worst half decade of growth in 30 years. So the next 5 years, they reckon, will be the worst period of growth that we've seen in 30 years. And you can see how their growth projections have gradually declined to the point where they now think that the average annual growth rate of the world will be around 3%. Remember that 3% growth rate includes China, India, Indonesia, other countries that are growing at 5 or 6% a year. So even taking those countries into account, the overall growth rate of the world economy is down to about 3%, according to the World Bank, compared to where it was in the 1990s of 4 to 5%. So in Asia in particular looks really bad, one of the worst economic outlooks in half a century for the so-called Asian tigers of Korea, Taiwan, and so on. So we can see that overall, not only have we had a decline in the rate of growth in the last 25 years compared to where it was in the 20th century, but looking forward into the 2030s, the situation is deteriorating further. Now, why is the world economy slowing down? Well, fundamentally, it boils down to investment. In a capitalist economy, growth takes place when capitalists invest in new technologies, expand the fixed asset base, the factories, the offices, the machines, the equipments, the computers, the technologies they've got, to expand that in order to get more productivity out of the workforce that they've got. But what we've seen gradually in the last 40 years or more is a decline in the investment rates. So whereas in the 1980s, the most advanced capitalist economies and the emerging ones, excluding China, had investment rates of about 25%. That's along here, these ones down the bottom. Now that rate has dropped to 22% overall. And in the case of the advanced economies, it's way down here at the bottom. We can see that China continues to have a very high investment rate, which justifies why they've been growing much faster than most other economies in the world. If we look at UK, which I know that Roger and Wynne wanted me to specialize a little bit on what's going on in the UK. Total UK investment to the GDP. So we're looking at the total investment that capitalist companies make in the UK compared to the output. So that ratio has been lower than just about all the other major capitalist economies over the last 30 years, and it's been declining. So if you see this red line over here, you can see this is the official figures. You can see the total investment to GDP has been dropping away over a whole period, particularly since the late 1990s, and now it's around about 17% of GDP compared to the rest of G7, which is around that 22%. So the UK is doing worse than the other 6 G7 economies in terms of investment. And no wonder it cannot grow and it faces all the problems it does. Why is investment slowing down? Well, in my view, it's because overall, the profitability of investing and holding and investing in machinery, technology, and building that up, and as opposed to labor, has been declining over a long period now in the major capitalist economies. Now, you might say, well, how is profitability declining? I read every day in the Financial Times, which I'm sure you all read, but even in the general papers, that there's a massive increase in profits of these big tech companies in the US, that the big oil and energy companies are making big profits, the banks are making profits, the investment banks are making huge profits. Yes, but if you do the whole swathe of companies in the US, Europe, and Japan, you find that actually the profits of the whole swathe of companies right across the board is not very good at all. In fact, the profitability on average, which is what this graph shows, has been declining over the long term. There's a period when it rose, the so-called neoliberal period, when privatizations, trade unions were smashed, capitalists moved their manufacturing to the so-called global south. But even since the late 1990s now, that rate of profit has gradually fallen on average across the board to a low just at the time of the pandemic slump. It's made a somewhat of a recovery in the last few years, but yet to be reflected particularly in an improvement in investment. And if I want to take the UK on its own, then it's exactly the same model, really. If not worse, we see a very sharp fall in the rate of profit from the 60s onwards into the 1980s, stabilization to some extent, a bit of recovery, and then we've just seen a steady fall in the profitability of invested capital for the capitalists in the UK. So that means that if profitability is falling, there's no incentive to invest hugely in productive assets. It's much better to look at investing in the financial markets, speculating in stocks and shares, buying, using the money that they have got to drive up the share price by buying back shares from owners of shares outside and giving huge dividends to the shareholders, rather than investing in productive investment, new technologies, and so on. So the productivity of labour begins to slip. Now, I want to say that, as Roger raised, that this situation of stagnating economies around the world and the situation getting worse, that it's increasing the intensity of some key crises that capitalism has not faced before in the 21st century, and it's not showing any ability to be able to deal with it. Some people have brought this together into one batch, saying that they're all connected to each other, which has a point, and they call it the poly crisis. So the first one is that inequality in the world is getting worse. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The rich countries are getting richer compared to the poor countries, and within even the rich countries, inequality is growing. The level of people who've got absolutely nothing in the world remains huge. And so inequality and poverty, a problem which has existed under capitalism for 150 years, is reaching extreme levels now, and it's not being dealt with. The other one, of course, is global warming and climate change. We see no end to the increase in global warming, and therefore the impact that it's having on the climate, with more wildfires, more floods, more people being placed in difficult situations in terms of heat and all the rest of it. The environment is being damaged severely. So all that is coming up as part of the development we've seen of the stagnating economies in capitalism and their inability to deal with it. And then, as Roger raised, an intensification now of geopolitical conflict between the major powers in the world over who's going to control shrinking growth, who's going to control the assets and resources of the world in order to preserve their position against others. And if we look at the situation in global poverty, it's worth just mentioning. There's a staggering 2.7 billion people who can only cover their basic needs for a month or less without any income. And of that number, nearly 1 billion could only survive for a week at most. So if they have nothing at all for a week, then they're into starvation positions. That's 1 billion out of the 8 billion humans in the world at the moment. And even including China, until the latest figures, there's 3.65 billion people on this planet who earn less than $6.85 a day, according to the World Bank. And if you think about that, that's something like, say, £5 a day over 300 days. So that's approximately, £1,500 a year. You're expected to live on that. Of course, that's in different countries, but nevertheless, it's an incredibly low level. And there are nearly 4 billion people below that level, That's the threshold level of the bare minimum survival level that the World Bank is prepared to put forward. And yet, on the other hand, we have a massively increased wealth for a very, very tiny proportion of the population. This is the very latest figure from the World Inequality Lab, which, would you believe, there's a laboratory in Paris where economists sit down and work out inequality levels for every country in the world. Very handy for me. Here is the wealth of the top 0.0001% of the population, which is actually 19 rich Americans. And there's a share of total US wealth in the US. This year, they're worth 3.1 trillion, the 19 rich Americans, and they have, as you can see, just around about 2% of all the personal wealth in the whole US. So out of the 146 trillion of total household wealth in the US, 3 trillion is in the hands of just 19 people. So you say, well, 3 out of 146 is not very big. I could show you other graphs to show that the top 10% have a massive amount of that total wealth, probably something like 60 to 70%. That shows you how unequal the most powerful and supposedly most prosperous economy in the world, the US, is at the moment in terms of wealth. And that also applies to income and to every other major economy. Inequality in Britain. Here's the latest figures from the Office of National Statistics. We have in the UK a very high inequality of income compared to other countries. We're the 9th most unequal country in terms of income out of the 38 OECD countries. And the wealth inequality, that's the inequality of personal wealth, whether you've got a home or you've got some savings and that, and you're taking out the debt, whatever you've got less, that's your personal net wealth. Now, the inequality there is even greater. The top 20% of people in the UK who've got any wealth take 36% of the income, but 63% of the country's personal wealth, mainly in houses, homes, but also in financial assets and so on. While the bottom 20% have only 8% of UK income and basically no wealth at all. So there's 20% of the UK population, that's households, have no wealth. They don't own a home. They don't have any savings. They don't have any way in which they probably have significant debts. So the position is that they're basically completely poor when it comes to the terms of anything that they've got to rely on if anything goes wrong. UK poverty now, since 2010, since the Tories came to power, has widened significantly. The UK has the widest disparity within regions in wages in the whole of Europe. So the people living in north of the country, in the northeast of England, have an average standard of living less than half that of the average Londoner. The most deprived areas of England, according to a latest report, have shown a significant decrease in life expectancy in this second half of the 2010s. You can see here that here is the UK's life expectancy level, which was 81 years on average, or just under, in 2010. It should, on the rate of growth in life expectancy we've seen in the previous period, have gone up to something like 82 or even higher. In fact, it only just crawled up to 81. I have to say that if I showed you the figure for the US, you'd actually see a fall in life expectancy. The US is deteriorating in its ability to keep its population alive. Child poverty rates have rocketed. The number of children living now in poverty, 4.2 million to 4.3 million. That's 30% of children in the UK are what are classed as being in households that have poverty. So that's a massive number of people, and nothing, of course, is changing that picture. And then when we get to the second part of the polycrisis, global warming is just accelerating now. It's not just rising above levels set as a target. In 2015, the conference, the International Conference on Climate Change, said that everybody should try and keep global warming from rising more than 1.5 centigrade degrees above the pre-industrial average, which was set for 1850 to 1900. Now in 2020, that was supposed to be dealt with. We're not supposed to reach that level globally. That was in 2015, and ideally we should be heading downwards. But what we see here is at the end of 2024, it's now 1.6 above the pre-industrial average. It is just, and you can see that line, it is beginning to accelerate. The situation is deteriorating fast. I don't need to tell you about the wildfires in Los Angeles, other things have happened in the States, that's the richest country, but also the terrible droughts that are taking place in different parts of Africa presently, and other problems that have arisen out of that. So there's no attempt, there's been no ability to reverse this process on rising temperatures. This is becoming an existential issue for the human population, which capitalism cannot deal with. This is the response of key people who are in charge of the fossil fuel industry globally on the position of rising global warming and climate change. The head of Saudi Arabia's Aramco, the biggest oil company, we should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas and instead invest in them, adequately reflecting realistic demand assumptions. In other words, people need oil and gas and fossil fuel energy, so let's just meet their targets. Forget about anything else. And as the head of ExxonMobil said, you can argue green all day and NGOs all day, but those are the facts. I think that message is beginning to resonate, he said. In other words, forget about global warming, forget about climate change, forget about environmental degradation. As Roger reminded us of what Trump said, drill, baby, drill. And that seems to be the policy. There is a general collapse in climate change mitigation taking place now. Each international conference that takes place makes no progress whatsoever in reducing emissions, let alone controlling the increase that's taking place. Capitalism has lost control. It's doing nothing about this particular issue. The third one is the increased danger of global conflict between different rival economic and political powers. You can see there's been the great period of apparently cooperation amongst the big international economic powers in reducing tariffs, in reducing quotas, in working out cooperative actions, led to what took place in a period when growth was still taking place at a reasonable rate, and global trade to GDP rose from 25% back in the 70s to just over 60% at the beginning of this century. But since then, and particularly since the Great Recession, that has reversed. We now have a decline in globalization as measured by global trade to GDP. And we're in a figure now that's back to where we were in the early part of this century. No progress at all in expanding trade for countries, particularly in the global south and in general. Now, it's not so much everybody taking a bigger share of the cake that's growing. Now the cake is shrinking. We have to fight over maintaining our share. And when we look, as I said before, at the general stagnation that's taken place globally, this is also reflected in the UK capitalist economy, which won't escape the twists and turns of the global capitalist economy. We can see growth projections here falling down, as I mentioned before. And the UK is now in a position where it faces the vagaries and fluctuations and rivalries which are existing on a world scale, as expressed perhaps by President Trump preparing to apply tariffs to Europe, possibly to the UK, and already started as of tomorrow for China, and at the moment holding, as it were, a big weapon over the heads of Mexico and Japan, of Canada for further tariff increases. How is the British government going to deal with this situation? Well, it seems to me the obvious thing to do. If the capitalists won't invest, we need the public sector to come in. We need to divert resources so that the state can increase investment in the productive areas to try and increase employment, improve wages, and boost the productivity of labour in so doing. A recent study by the London School of Economics reckoned that if we had an increase in public investment of 1% of GDP, or that's a rise of 26 billion a year at current prices, then we will begin to at least close the losses that we've had over the last 14 years under the Tories. But what is the Reeves-Starmer government planning? Just not 26 billion a year, but 7.3 billion over the whole Parliament, over the whole 5 years, in order to, they claim, through their National Wealth Fund, to do transformative investments. This is a tiny prick in changing the picture. Under the Corbyn-led Labour Party, they have proposed 25 billion over 5 years, which would have been inadequate, but it's something like 5 times larger than the Reeves-Starmer package. And that's an indication of how mealy-mouthed, narrow-minded and unclear about what to do that the Starmer government has. According to a more important report, what we really need is 60 billion a year to invest in industry and public services over the next 5 years, so 12 billion a year, 60 billion a year over 5 years, so that's 300 billion, a rise of at least 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP each year. Just to say, the public investment as a percentage of GDP in the UK is around 3%. So basically, to solve this, to make a real transformative change in the state of the British economy, we would need to double the rate of public investment as a share of GDP in this parliament. And it's not even going to be considered because the Starmer-Reeves government says that public investment should have nothing to do with it. What we need to do is encourage the capitalist sector of Britain to invest productively by cutting regulations, by reducing taxes on them, corporate tax and other things, not certainly not taxing the rich people who own these industries through any wealth tax. So their idea is that the private sector is going to solve Britain's problems, and yet the last, how can I put it, 40 years have shown that is not the case. So let me complete my contribution by asking the basic question: can capitalism escape from this stagnation, this depression, whether it's in Britain, in Europe, in North America, and across the world? Can it escape from this depression? In my view, there are just three possibilities. First of all, capitalism works on the basis of will only expand if it's profitable to invest and expand. Now, the only way to restore profitability, which you can see is very low, is by destroying a lot of the value of the old capital, the old machinery, the weak companies, unproductive workers as defined by capitalist profitability. And the way you do that fundamentally is to go through a slump. You put people out of work, you close down companies that aren't working, or you take them over, you reduce the cost of production, you raise the profitability for those that survive, and on the basis of that, then you can have a new period of expansion. A phrase used by a mainstream economist, an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter, he called it creative destruction. And interesting to know that capitalism works on the basis of creative destruction. First destroy and then revive. Now, the second way that things could change is if we have a technological revolution which dramatically increases the productivity of labor without a large amount of expenditure on the part of the capitalists. So we could talk about robots, artificial intelligence, and so on, which is the flavor of the year at the moment, as the way in which capitalism could get out of this depression by increasing productivity and not having to raise too much capital to do so. And the third way, as Roger has mentioned, is that if none of those things work, then it's a question of every person for himself in a great big battle to kind of improve the compositions of the relative position of one country over another, which could lead to trade and technology wars and investment blockages and even to military conflict. Capitalism in the past has got out of trouble through a major war or the defeat of revolutions in the 1850s, 1920s, and the 1950s, and those periods were boom periods for capitalism after defeat of revolutions or the defeat of a particular country and the re-establishment of control by the winners. And that's what we saw in those particular periods. Are we heading for something like that again? Now, before we get to the end of this decade, let's take the first one, creative destruction. What is the chances of a new slump before the end of the decade? Well, first of all, financial asset prices are well out of line with earnings. In other words, the stock market is at record levels. There's a massive amount of money going on into mergers and acquisitions, but the profits being made by the companies which are being invested in or taken over is minimal. So we have a huge gap between the speculative prices produced in the financial markets and the stock market you read every day, and actually what the reality is for these companies. That division cannot last forever. Something will have to go. Either earnings have got to dramatically improve, that's corporate earnings, I don't mean our wages, I mean profits, will have to improve drastically, or there'll be a crash in the stock market, and that's the real danger. But earnings aren't improving. Corporate profits growth has been grinding to a halt. I saw a figure yesterday which said that the big 7 tech companies that everybody talks about are going to have something like a 30% increase in profits. The rest of the US major companies are growing at 3 to 4% a year. That's barely above the inflation rate. So they're really, in real terms, not growing at all in terms of profits. And we have record levels of debt. Global debt is now something like 300% of world GDP. In the big countries like the US, business debt, that's the debt liable to the corporations, is at record levels, particularly compared to their earnings. So this is putting real danger of the whole process of the capitalist economy toppling over, because it's overloaded with debt and it's speculating well beyond what's possible. And as Roger mentioned briefly, that it seems there are signs that inflation's going back up again. If you've seen the Bank of England's report this week when it cut interest rates. It said, where's inflation going to go? By the end of the year, inflation is going from where it is at the moment, which is about 2.4%, to 3.7%. It's going back up again. And that also applies to some extent in the US as well. We're seeing a rise in inflation there and in some of the European countries, which are already on the knees anyway. In that situation, central banks may be forced to consider raising rates rather than reducing them as they've been doing up to now. So we have a real danger that corporations who are supposedly going to invest to get us out of this crisis are seeing their profits growth grind to a halt, but the cost of borrowing is rising because interest rates are rising due to the fact that inflation's coming back, mainly in food, mainly in energy. Did you know that I saw a figure today that eggs in the US is partly a problem with bird flu, but egg prices have quadrupled in the last few weeks in the US. So that I just saw the price of a dozen eggs in the US and that's its wholesale price, was $7.50, which is about £6 for a dozen eggs. Wholesale, that's before they get to the supermarket and their margin. And that's what Americans are paying now for eggs, a basic thing that people buy as part of food. It's partly due to the bird flu crisis, but the bird flu crisis is also a product of what's been happening in terms of no regulation, no control over what's going on in the farming industry in the US and elsewhere. But maybe artificial intelligence is going to save us all. So we have OpenAI, we have ChatGPT, we have NVIDIA building chips that will mean that we can just hand things over to artificial intelligence, which is basically, so the argument goes, software, and the Chinese have got into it with this DeepSeek. This is the new savior of capitalism globally. Of course, this is hiding the fact that it's not doesn't require a lot of investment in machinery and so on. This is nonsense. Huge plants have to be built for data computing. Energy has to be used in order to get these plants to work efficiently. And there's a huge amount of money being poured in by the big companies in order to achieve some result on productivity of labor out of all this. What's the chances that it will increase the productivity of labor? Well, here's an interesting graph from the OECD. They say, now look at what's happened in previous great technologies. They start with electric power, which is that green square there, back in 1900, if you like. Electric power discovered and it started to be introduced. So what this line says here, going this upwards, this is how much it spreads across, this technology spreads across an economy. So it starts, when you invent something, only maybe 5% of companies are using electricity in 1900. And it gets up to 60%. When? Well, if you look, you can see by 1914, it's got up to 40%, 1909 and so on. So basically, when it introduced in 1900, and then it goes up to reach the 50% level in 1919. So it takes about 20 years for electricity, a great technological advance, to spread across economies so that more than 50% of sectors in economies are using electricity. So it really begins to have an effect on improving the economy. Then if you take personal computers, which is the little triangle here, discovered and developed starting around about 1984, gets up to 35% in 1989, 1993 there. And then so finally, we get up in 2003 to over 50%. So basically, again, it's taking another 20 years before personal computers have become sitting in our homes and our companies everywhere, and not just some sort of interesting technological discovery as they were in the 80s. What about AI? Well, OECD says, look at AI. AI is the red dot here, if you like. Here we are in 2024, so about 5% of the sectors of the major economies are using AI in production and in their operations, 5% at the moment. So they're down to the level of where the electric power was in 1900 and more or less where computers were in the 1980s or earlier. So we could we can assume that really, if it's going to take the same pace, it won't be till the 2040s that AI will become widely used in every sort of area of life or in operations in companies, assuming that it does deliver what it's supposed to deliver. Maybe it will be quicker, but clearly it's not going to be quick enough to dramatically change things over the next 5 or 10 years, in my view. So that brings us to the third and final possibility for the period ahead, that the trade war that we have now and beginning, we started in 2016 with Trump, and earlier even to some extent, continued it with Biden, and now Trump too is moving towards the solution as far as the US capitalists are concerned, or at least the Trump section of it, is that forget about global cooperation, forget about trade and investment being expanded. We're going to expand our part of the control of the economy, and we're going to do that by weakening other countries through trade tariffs and other measures and sanctions, and boosting American industry relative to the rest of the world. That is the policy of the Trump administration, and we'll see where that goes. If it does not succeed, then the intensification of conflict between the rest of the world and the US will increase. We already have a war in Ukraine, but there's every possibility now that we're building up to a position where Europe versus Russia is going to be increasingly the danger within Europe, and the return to some sort of war boundaries between Russia, according to the government of Sweden, the government of Finland, the government of Denmark, government of Poland. Russia is about to invade Europe, and as soon as if they win in Ukraine, they'll be swarming across into Europe and taking away our democratic rights and so on. So Russia has to be crushed and driven back, is currently the policy of Europe. That dangerous conflict continues to exist. And then, of course, there's the big one between the US and China. China is the main enemy for the US as far as Trump's concerned, and for that matter, Biden. The aim must be to turn China back from growing economically. Roger said that it's becoming the leading power. I'm not so sure it's the leading power yet, because that's why the US wants to stop it. They aim to stop it before it becomes a superior power to the Americans, at least in economic terms. So they aim to strangle it with trade barriers and technology bans. They aim to force it back, to build up opposition also within China, to perhaps have regime change. If all that fails, to provoke it into war over the question of Taiwan, which then will give them the opportunity to apply a worldwide ban and all the other measures, for example, are taken against Russia, but now at triple levels against China. So these are the real dangers ahead of us, that we have a new slump before the end of the decade. We have failing policy of AI, not really transforming the picture. And we have the possibility of increased war as we go forward. And that's where we are happily placed for us to discuss at the moment.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for that. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I must say, on questions of economics, I often find myself baffled and confused. But when you speak, Michael, you shine such a sharp, clear light on everything that it everything becomes completely comprehensible and clear. And I think that was a really, brilliant explanation of the situation, and also, of course, a very somber warning of why it's so urgent that the working class gets its act together and builds a force which is able to resist the attacks that are coming or that have started already. So I'm sure there'll be a number of questions and comments and contributions. Who wants to go first? Yes, Charles.
Seeing no one else, I'll jump in and talk about, I guess the elephant isn't necessarily in the room, it's right there. in what the United States want to surround and control is the rising and emergent imperialist power of China. And we've been studying Michael's work and participated in the last two discussions with the Comrades of Win. And it appears there seems to be a difference on our understanding of the emergence of Chinese imperialism and the ability to use state monopoly capital to grow Chinese capitalism, and the question of whether or not state monopoly capital needs to actually make profit, or sovereign wealth funds need to actually make profit in order to grow a capitalist economy. And the implications, obviously, for the working class in the growing conflict is, how does the working class develop its program and respond to the unfolding wars? We in the Communist Workers Group, International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency, see the wars between Russia and the United States as a proxy war over Ukraine, and the hotspots around the world as being a face-off between the emergent Russia-China imperialist bloc competing to grab to its circle the dependent nations who are navigating between the two imperialist blocs to try to find the better win-win deal versus the super exploitation. Now, in the last 2 weeks, we've talked about this, and Finn mentioned, when I raised inter-imperialist struggle, Finn kind of mentioned that he didn't really see it as an inter-imperialist struggle. And then in closing last week, Roger mentioned that he leans more towards Michael Roberts' understanding of the transitional economy and for China, which kind of drops away from the traditional Trotskyist understanding of it being a deformed worker state, and our analysis of the restoration of China, the destruction of the monopoly of foreign trade with the joining of the GATT. And we talked about these last year, the defeat of the working class in 1989 with the Tiananmen, and the export, the trajectory of the OFDI year over year from, say, 2008 up through the present, which we've seen as a growing trajectory from China, which implies even though there's still a large FDI component going into China, a direction towards imperialism. So, the question of sovereign wealth funds, not just in China, investing to support, as you discussed in the UK, the need for the debate in the UK over whether the sovereign wealth is going to be used to pull the economy out of the slump by investing to maybe take up those low profit things, but to sustain the economy. All those raise the question of, are we going to fight for an international working class new Zimmerwald that's going to take a dual defeatist position to bring down both imperialist powers and demand to turn the guns around in the United States and the UK, in conjunction with the working class in Russia and China, to turn their guns around against their ruling classes and capitalist class expansion? Or are we going to choose one imperialist power over the other, as many of the tankies are doing in Russia and Ukraine today? So I'll close off there.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Charles. Matthew?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. No, I think it's a bit different. I mean, I think I don't agree with the previous speaker. I don't think China is imperialist, nor is Russia, actually. But I think that's a different debate. I think the key here is the question of what the nature of capitalism at this point, and where is it going? And I think that the basic thing we're seeing actually, of course, is the refusal of the ruling class to invest. It's actually obviously has moved to the use of parasitic finance capital. It did that in the early 70s. And clearly he's moved away, in those terms, and built this massive structure of parasitic finance capital, and has even stockpiling, just straightforward stockpiling money, because it refuses to invest. So in those terms, it's quite conscious. The question is, okay, how does it? What is its current intention? The one thing, of course, in terms of finance capital is now you have a system where all of the banks are essentially integrated up together. They can't be touched. They're all also, of course, completely dependent on the state. The only thing which keeps banks going is the fact they are guaranteed. Each state actually guarantees its own banks. If the state withdrew the guarantee, then the banks would fold in very short order, I would suspect. So effectively, you can say the banks are nationalised, but under conditions in which obviously the ruling class carries off, amounts of money from them. And you can see, that when things go wrong, essentially the system exploded or imploded in 2007-8, and it remains unresolved. And you can see essentially with the response to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, essentially what they did was the same thing, was pump it full of more money, chop it up again and throw it back in and hope the whole system keeps going. That can't be done forever. That system is still in extremis and may well indeed be the point that the whole lot falls apart. I think the other thing you have to say in terms of capitalism is that with the advent of Trump in particular, but also, of course, the fact that the main offer, it's quite clear, the main offer of capitalism now is genocide and war. Okay, the US and the British and so on and so forth have had this thing, whereby they say, okay, we're democratic, we offer democracy and all this sort of stuff up against all these other people, and we're wonderful and good guys and all this. All of that's been abandoned, of course. Now, of course, they just offer, war, genocide. And of course, all imperialist politicians are entirely prepared for mass killing. They haven't. This is the lesson of Gaza. Is all of these people are quite happy to kill as many people, whatever, by whichever means, usually barbaric ones, without turning a hair or raising any objection or any of this sort of stuff. They'll just do it. So the offer in no terms of saying, well, we're in favour of democracy and so forth has gone down the tube. So the other thing, of course, the significance of Trump actually, of course, is the fact that what Trump is doing and what Musk is doing, the fact what you've got is the US state is now being directly seized by the oligarchs. Not a question that you have the state machine and the oligarchs off to one side. Now the oligarchs are directly seizing hold of the mechanisms of the state itself. Because obviously to serve their purposes. And what they want is a frontal assault on the working class, on its democratic rights, on its living standards, you name it, all of that, they want shot off. Because obviously they can't do this without a vast attack on democracy, democratic rights of all types. And a serious assault. This is what Musk means, of course, is to say, well, you take out trillions of dollars from the living standards of the US working class and give them to us. That's what they want, and that of course will be followed by all the others, because of course obviously the US is the hegemon still, although of course in a very very parlous condition. And the system itself is in a parlous condition. That's the point. And the question is then, okay, well, all right, well, what is the response of the working class? Unfortunately, of course, the working class has not presented itself on the stage yet. And of course, obviously, we can see that in terms of the state of the left, which is terrible. But we can see it in terms of the state of the workers' organisations, which are also terrible. The fact that the immediate response of US workers, which has started. It started in the last week or two, does not involve any of the unions. None of them. The traditional working class organisations, of course, have actually been subsumed effectively into the machine, the political state machine of the capitalists. You know, the union bureaucracy actually functions as an arm, in many ways, an arm of the capitalist state. So things are going to get interesting. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. It's Joe, then Steve, then Dave.
Hi there, can you hear me there? All good?
Yes, sure. Yep.
Okay, yeah, and I'm just going to touch on a point which is not central to the discussion, but it was raised by Michael there, that some people see Russia as potentially an imperialist power. Now, obviously, I don't believe it doesn't really matter for this discussion here whether Michael believes that or not. The point is that is the central message that's pumped out in the media, that Russia is actually an imperialist power, seeks to be an imperialist power, wants to restore its greatness, compare Putin with Peter the Great. He wants to be the new Peter the Great, and so on. It's all absolute rubbish, and we have got the proof of that in the simple fact that for the last 6 months inside Russia, there's been a Ukrainian division which the Russians have not managed to expel. Now, how can a country that's supposed to be a superpower tolerate an incursion into their own territory for 6 months and cannot, even with the supremacy of numbers, shift that Ukrainian incursion? It exposes the claim that Russia has got any ability whatsoever, has not got the ability to invade other countries, even smaller countries, never mind setting their sights on Western Europe. So the claim that Russia is somehow intent on spreading its wings militarily, financially, destroy the European economy and so on, it's just a propaganda tool being used to possibly prepare the way for a war economy, for maybe a war by Europe, flexing its muscles on Russia, because Russia is actually quite an easy target. Russia's been bled dry to a large degree. It's struggling to find troops. It's struggling to get to keep their own war machine going. So it would be a very soft and easy target, in my opinion, in today's world than would have been the case 30, 40 years ago. And I know Russia's a nuclear power, but for those who want to, take this to the extreme, I don't think they're afraid of it in the same way as there's a wing of the American establishment, which is also maybe prepared to have a World War III in relation to China and so on. So I think that's important, because in relation to our economic perspectives, Michael is right to factor in that some strategists inside the establishment are looking at a war economy as being possibly a way out, because in the absence of a war economy, and in the presence of a slump which materializes, and a severe and extreme slump is possible, it's inherent within this, given the polycrisis that has been mentioned, then resorting to war is a way for the system to survive, because they cannot allow a situation where you're getting solidarity building up between nations. They do not want to envisage a working class response to this. So to cut across this, as in all situations similar in the past 100, 150 years, the nation states are prepared to go to war to cut across the development of class struggle. And I think that's, the context for this empty and completely bogus claim that Russia has the capacity or has any intention of going into small countries, never mind taking on the larger countries in Western Europe.
Thanks, Joe. If I could just make a point about the way the discussion should go from here. I do think that's a very important issue to discuss, the nature of the Russian state and of the Chinese state, come to that. And I know there's a lot of controversy about that too. And I'm not at all criticizing Joe for raising it, but I'd just like to guide the meeting that I hope that we won't get sidetracked from the focus on the perspectives of the world economy. And I know it's also central to the discussion of the perspectives for the world economy. But I think, let's try to keep it broader than that particular aspect. So, I'm not prohibiting comrades from commenting on it, but just I'm asking comrades to keep in mind that we don't want to get we don't want it to get diverted into that particular issue.
Yeah, I had no intention of diverting it there, right? Just like no intention. It's just a point that was mentioned in passing. So I mentioned it in passing. It's not the central point of the thing. I totally agree with you there. Totally.
Yeah. It's not intended as a criticism, Joe, and that is an issue that I think maybe we should have a meeting specifically devoted to that issue in the near future about the nature of both the Russian and the Chinese state. But anyway, next, Steve.
Yeah, well, thanks, Michael, for your presentation. I mean, I think that we have to look at the crisis of the world capitalist economy. First of all, the drive to get more profits, to increase the profitability of capitalism. And that is what is leading to inter-imperialist rivalry between the United States and other capitalist countries. I mean, Trump is trying to rebuild American capitalism, which is declining very rapidly, and he's actually escalating the decline. And I think that, what do we mean by increasing the profitability today in the world economy? What does that mean? And what it means, in our view, is the rise of fascist movements. And we believe we have a fascist government in the United States that is implementing Project 2025, which is a fascist program to end the bourgeois democratic state and to crush the working class, crush the unions, to destroy, privatize, as Millet has been trying to do, privatize all public services, public education, and take away democratic rights of unions so that they can't organize. And it seems like the issue of fascism is not really part of the crisis of capitalism and imperialism in this discussion, and that's a real problem. China is the largest exporter of capital in the world. China is exploiting the workers of Namibia and the workers of Africa and other countries for profits. They're not only public companies, but they're private companies. Russia as well is exploiting. They have investments, and they work with regimes that are corrupt, and they're taking gold and other resources out of Africa. So the idea that China is somehow not an imperialist force internationally is not our view. And I think that the inter-imperialist rivalry now between the United States and China is winning. In fact, the attack by Trump on the Canadians, on the Mexicans, on Panama, is actually helping China. China is benefiting from those attacks. I mean, the desperate attacks. China looks like a stable country to have relations with. China can provide resources. They can invest in these countries, which they're doing in Peru and other countries with railroads and other development projects. So there's a panic in the American capitalist class. They don't have a solution other than war, really, with these other countries. That's their solution, imperialist war. And historically, that's always been the solution to the crisis of the capitalists. They have to go and grab markets and have war. But in order to do that, it requires the crushing of the working class. And that's why it's no accident that the richest section of the capitalist class are funding fascists, are going to Germany, are going to countries around the world, encouraging fascist parties. Musk and these techno-fascists represent a fascist current internationally in the richest section of the capitalists globally. I mean, he's the richest man in the world, and the techno-fascists have become one of the most powerful forces economically in the world today. That is the reality in the United States. The other thing that I think we have to add about the drive for profits in the world economy is AI and general AI and the need to remove workers, increase the rate of profit by eliminating workers. And as I've said before in the discussion in these meetings, Goldman Sachs did a study that they said 350 million workers could lose their jobs. In California, you have autonomous cabs, and they want autonomous trucks. We're talking about millions of workers losing their jobs. And there's no solution under capitalism to protect these workers. And that is a very one way of increasing the profits of capitalism by eliminating labor. However, of course, there's a contradiction in that because who's going to buy the products if workers are eliminated? They can't. You produce commodities for exchange. If there are no workers to buy the products, then you've got a crisis, a fundamental crisis in the capitalist economy. The other thing is where we're going globally in the world economy, and I think we're going globally towards a mass economic depression. You have a cryptocurrency bubble. You have a massive speculative bubble because that's how capitalists are making profits, not in production, by financial speculation. In this massive financial speculation, led by these cryptocurrency maniacs, are going to lead to a crash, a financial crash globally that are going to create a depression in the world global economy, including in China, because China, a lot of China's growth is in export of products. If there's a world depression, they will be affected as well in this global economy. And again, I think that we have to look at the interconnection of the crisis of imperialism, imperialist war, with the crisis, the economic crisis within world capitalism, in order to understand why these developments are taking place. Last point, I think that as far as the working class is concerned, the need to unite internationally is critical, and there are a group of parties, working class parties around the world, that are calling for an international day of action on the 24th of this month, the anniversary of the Ukraine war, and we're going to be having an action at Travis Air Force Base to stop the drive towards war and military. And we have to fight in the unions and workers around the world for workers' action against the genocide in Palestine with an arms blockade to Israel, but also against the war machine. And that means mobilizing the working class and unions to take action. And obviously the union bureaucracy in all these countries is opposed to mass worker mobilization against imperialist war. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what's needed internationally.
Thank you, Steve. Dave.
Dave has to unmute. Dave has to unmute.
Yeah, Dave, you're muted.
Yeah, how's that? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now, yes.
Okay. I'm new here, so I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is David Bedgegood. I'm sorry my surname wasn't up there. I think this is a very good discussion. I want to come back to the original contribution, Michael's contribution, because I think he raised the really important questions, but left hanging in the air, literally, the red line in this first draft, his first graph of China sitting at the top, but separated by the huge mass of the graph from the G7 countries at the bottom, who are clearly stagnating. And what's behind this story, obviously, is that the West is gone. The West is going down. Trump is the perfect catalyst for this, with a drive towards isolationism, a drive to raise the borders, send all the migrants home. This is going to be replicated around the world. And so the way out of that is clearly blocked. Capitalism is no way to go. And as Steve said, well, except fascism, and that's clearly where it's going to go, which means we have to mobilize, obviously, against fascism. If we're going to think about growth, the only growth that's going to come out of the West in the future is if the working class take power. That's when you'll see the growth. So that's where we have to organize ourselves. But the question of China is like an elephant in the room, really. We can't really talk about what's going to happen to the whole global economy unless we fix on China's role in what is currently going on. China is now the best economic performer. Its growth is well above 6%, yes. We keep getting this narrative from the West saying it's in decline, it's collapsing, just like Russia, but neither of them are. Every time the West has attacked them with economic warfare and actual military warfare in its proxy wars and so on, what we see is a boost to the Eastern Bloc around China and Russia, and the global South is rushing in huge numbers into the BRICS because they see China and the bloc around China as a salvation to what's going on in the West. The West is dying and the East is rising. It's as clear as mud. It's as clear, it's extremely clear that is what is going on. So we have to reorient our argument around, can China rescue us? What is China? Does it have the capacity to rescue us? And what are the benefits of this? And what are the progressive aspects of China's expansion? What are its threatening aspects of it? I'm sorry, I can see Steve Rogers grimacing because, yes, I'm sorry, I've gone back to the thing you didn't want us to talk about. But and I'm not going to go on in any greater length. We have a difference with Michael on what China is, clearly. And I think there's a whole element there which can be explained, but I don't need to do it here. We've written an article which is a critique of Michael's position on China, which I'm sure Charles will put in the chat or whatever, so it's available to see. And I'll stop on that point and say, really, yeah, the thrust of discussions like this, a weekly discussion like this, has got to be to see, what is progressive about China's expansion of the forces of production vis-a-vis the West's destruction of the forces of production. All of the Marxist categories are right there, right in our face, being thrust under our nose. And it always comes back to the point that Steve has said at the end. When capitalism gets to the point where it's in total crisis, it goes to war, and a part of that war is fascism. And Lenin is the one who said, look, the beginning of the 20th century, this is what we're in. We're in an epoch of imperialism. It is an epoch of crises, wars, and revolutions. And we're in this, comrades, right up to our necks.
Okay, thank you. By the way, that wasn't a grimace on my part. Just the way
Oh, sorry.
All right, Comrade Aman.
Thank you. I just wanted to first say thanks, Mike. I think it was a good way of actually explaining the situation with regard to so far as the indicators are concerned in all respects. There was one thing which I think is probably helpful in here. Looking at it from another angle, I think perhaps partly politically rather than economically probably could help us in here. And when I say politically, I don't mean the economics doesn't matter or there is a contradiction here, but we are actually in a part of the world where we're seeing a change. We saw the change with the fall of the Berlin Wall, as unipolar as was called, and moved from a two-pole to a single pole, had a huge amount of issues. Similarly, moving from a unipolar to a multipolar wall does have its own issues. It has to bring a lot of factors in, whether we're looking at it from the point of view of the changes in terms of the crisis that the capitalism is in, irrespective of whether China gets upper hand or not. But it's a changing of the world across everywhere. There are other issues which I think capitalists could actually think about to some extent. We see rising militarization and everything else. The main point I took from what Michael was saying, that what Trump is doing is not going to provide an answer. I think that was the main thrust. That's what I got. It is not going to be an answer. Massive growth in China is not going to provide an answer. The change in technology is not going to provide an answer. What is being said is, it doesn't matter what your view is of China or isn't, what your view is of Russia or isn't. The economics actually are showing, the indicators are showing that this is a very, very deep crisis. And that crisis is not going to be resolved by themselves. A war between imperialists now is not going to be like a Second World War. There are nuclear powers in there. So a situation of Second World War is not going to recur. War through proxies seem to have been more of an issue. That seems to be more of a case. The second point, I think, which is useful in here to find is that the idea of a lot of talk that make America great or whatever else, or movement, whether under protectionism or otherwise, is failing non-stop. We see it even in the situation of the Israel and the getting Gaza out or whatever. Everybody knows none of these are going to provide an answer. The other parts of the world are also bourgeoisie in variety of countries across the world are trying to actually put not all their eggs in one basket, and they're diverting. And this is going to change the whole scenario further. What I'm trying to say is that obviously the idea of fascism is one issue, one possibility, but there are others. It's not going to be a replication of the past. And I think it would be wrong for us to assume everything is going to be the same as it was after post-World War II. There are a variety of situations which are changing. And I think this was what Roger was saying, that everything is changing. Recognize we're not going to have a replication of the past. And sticking to the maze or possibility of seeing political forces and governments and bourgeoisie in different countries following exactly the same thing they did in the past is not going to happen again. Things are changing. New situations are arising from the point of view of uprisings and possibility of revolutions. A quarter of a millimeter rise in the water in global warming could take half of Vietnam underwater. And that changes the whole economy of the region. So there are many new things that are coming. I think considering all of this, the question is, what should the working class do in different places? That's one question which I think is in front of anybody who wants to see a change, on one hand. Two, predictions, I don't think works long term. Everybody's very pragmatic now. All bourgeois, imperialists, etc., are very pragmatic. They actually taking it effectively, I think, not even 5-year period. They're looking at everything on a yearly short-term basis. And because they're taking everything on a short-term basis, what we're seeing is not the logic of capitalism in here, but survival for many of them. And this survival means all new things are going to happen. So preparation in all fronts is going to be on the agenda. Preparation from the point of view of, especially at a time where the old social democracy has gone, everybody knows they're bankrupt. Everybody knows there is a huge anti-establishment because they cannot provide an answer. And unless left actually puts an answer, right, whether fascism or otherwise, is going to take the role for some more time. So I think these are the main issues that are at hand, rather than whether China or US or any one of them is going to produce an answer. And furthermore, with what Trump is suggesting, I think, or what he's actually putting forward, is not a short term, but is something that is a saying. And some parts, and we're seeing in many parts, the capitalists across the world are taking similar approach. And that means new things are coming on everybody's plate. And I think that is the main issue to consider. That's it. Thanks very much, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Aman. Nora.
Thank you. Thank you, the last speaker, because I was getting very depressed. I'm not an academic. I don't understand half the things that people have, the letters to different things. I know there are gamblers in the stock markets. I know they make their money without involving things that are actually made. But I think the fact that these people are in power is to do with the failure of parliamentary democracy everywhere. It doesn't work, and I think that's one thing that is important. I think it's. I have to get my glasses on. I haven't got them in this room. People I know are struggling. I live in South Yorkshire in England, and 20% of the people in South Yorkshire are not online, so technology is not really a big thing for them. They're struggling, and the working class that I know are they're not in highfalutin jobs. They're so, well, I was going to say sweeping the streets, but nobody does that now. They're driving the buses, driving the trains, and working in shops and cafes and bars and things, with not very much money, and there's no jobs for interesting work. They work in warehouses, all supporting the capitalists, but they don't feel as though they've got any hope for the future, because just surviving and paying for their gas bills and their food and feeding and clothing their kids is enough to deal with every day. And the youngsters need you lot and people like me to try and give them some hope and to have answers to all these problems that they can understand. I've struggled to keep up with the conversation because you're all very academic and you've read a lot and you understand a lot more than I do. I know things are wrong, but how are we going to get the young working class aware that there is an answer, and what is the answer, and how are we going to go about it?
Yeah, very pertinent question, Nora, and one that really will exist among many other groups to try to find an answer to that crucial question. Dominic, I think, is that your hand up?
Yeah, it may sound like an academic thing that I'm going to ask, but what I can't see is how AI is going to solve the crisis of profitability for the capitalists and provide some solution for stability in the future, if that's the point. I mean, as I understand it, profit is the surplus value created by the working class, stolen by the capitalists. How do you make profit out of AI? There's no surplus value in AI. There's only surplus value in the production that it enables people to use. So you could out-compete your rival because you've got more modern technology. But if everybody's chasing around getting more technology with the aim of getting rid of the workers, because that will increase profits, seems to me upside down. So I'd like Michael to explain it a bit more, if that's possible.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Dominic. Nobody else has their hand up at the moment. Does anybody else want to come in now? Because if not, maybe, Michael, you could answer some of those questions. I mean, really, you could go on for 2 or 3 hours easily, I'm sure. But I mean, this is not necessarily the final summing up. Perhaps you'd like to just comment on some of them, and perhaps that will entice more comrades to come into the discussion. I would say just one thing, that I think for future meetings, there are two issues that came up a little bit to the side of the group main thing today, but I think we should be discussing, as I said before, what is imperialism, and perhaps another one, what is fascism, and all the implications of both those questions. But if we, it's up to you, Michael, to come in now on some of the questions that have been raised.
Yes, well, I'm not going to deal with the question of the nature of the Chinese state, or whether Russia is imperialist or Chinese. China is imperialist. Sorry if that upsets the people who've written a nice piece criticizing my position, but perhaps we can have that discussion at another time. But all I would say is that I don't think that China has been closing the gap with the US economically and technologically, that it's going to save the world by its growth rate. I don't think any one country can do that. I think that's the point about the situation of a world economy in the 21st century, that they're all linked together. And if the major economies are doing badly, then any other economy that's doing better will not be able to transform the picture on its own. Even the United States, which is growing better than the other top 7 capitalist economies, at least in terms of national output, not in terms of the life expectancy and conditions for American people, but even the United States cannot drive forward the rest of the world. In fact, of course, that is what Trump recognizes. As far as he was concerned, the job is no longer to have the United States leading a global movement for capitalism to improve it. It's now just the United States who's going to be made great again at the expense of others. And that's perhaps you might call the development we've now seen in the last, since the Great Recession, increasing in its intensity and therefore increasing the rivalry between the major economic powers. So as Aman put it, I think pretty well, none of the options available to capitalism to get out of this stagnation, or what I used to call the long depression, which still exists, seems viable. It's not going to be achieved by creative destruction, probably. That would be a major event. And I think I agree with other speakers who said that all the conditions are moving towards another slump, probably by the end of this decade, given the financial situation, given the level of debt, given the low level of profitability. But even that might not be enough to transform the picture. And as was very carefully raised, I think, that academic point that Tom made is that AI is not going to achieve that. I mean, one of the contradictions of this is if you're going to introduce artificial intelligence and get rid of 300 million jobs, as Goldman Sachs says, over the next few years, and replace them with machine learning machines, which do all the work, answer your phone calls, do your essays, prepare your food with some sort of formula, all the jobs. I mean, only somebody said it'd be great if AI did all the laundering and washing, but in fact, what AI is going to do is replace all the skilled jobs, leaving us to do all the laundry and washing. So that if that's losing 300 million jobs, is that going to create profitability for capitalism? Well, probably not, because in many ways, it won't be introduced unless it's sufficiently profitable. It's a chicken and egg argument here, and that's the problem with these new technologies. You've got to have a certain level of profitability, which incentivizes capitalists to spend the money on it. Yes, they're spending the money amongst the major tech companies, but will it spread across the economy? As I say, that's still open to debate. So on the one hand, the 3 things I posed about the situation are, firstly, that capitalism needs a slump in order to raise profitability. Secondly, artificial intelligence could take some time before it has an effect on the productivity of labor, perhaps increasing growth and getting capitalist economies out of depression. And in the meantime, as Aman pointed out, it's all looking short term. So the option is for every country and its capitalist class to do what it can on its own in order to transform the picture for them at the expense of others. So we have the rising up of a trade war, of a technology war, and possibly even something more serious, whether it's proxy wars or worse. In the meantime, we're moving towards, how can I put it this way, a level of irrationality from the capitalist class. I mean, the capitalist class should not allow climate change and global warming to take place. It's going to damage the planet. It's going to reduce profits. It's going to create a very difficult situation for broad sections of the capitalist class and companies over time. I don't mean their own personal living conditions, but the ability for capitalism to function if it allows global warming to get out of control. And yet it is not going to do anything about it. Capitalists don't want wars. I mean, the big capitalists don't want wars. It's not in their interest. It can't do business very easily in wars unless you can sell to both sides, but maybe you'll be annihilated in a nuclear war. So, but yet we seem to be going like an uncontrolled movement down a hill towards these irrational situations. This is way worse than it was in the 20th century or the 90th. So this is the real danger, it seems to me, in front of us. Now, Nora says, well, it's all very fine to talk about this and show me some lovely graphs about why this might be the case. But here in South Yorkshire, and we're just struggling to make a living for the vast majority of people living in the area. One of the graphs, by the way, that Nora, I showed you was that the level of difference in income and prosperity for people in South Yorkshire compared to people in London is staggeringly a huge gap. There's nothing worse. The relative gap in the UK is way worse than it is in Europe and even in the US. That's the indication of how bad things are in the terms of vast part of Britain, which has been left to just collapse in the last 20 years. And people are struggling to make a living in all these sort of low-paid, rather intensive jobs in many cases in the private sector. And we're told that we're still going to have further reductions in the public sector, in the councils and other institutions because we can't afford councils. Well, most councils in the UK are bust. They have no money. They can't do anything. I was talking to somebody who's a council worker yesterday down here in the south of England, and she said to me, every day I get people coming up to me and say, why don't you fix this? Why doesn't the rubbish come along? Why are all these potholes? Why don't you do something about it? She says, I'm totally depressed because we can do nothing about it. There is no money. We cannot deliver. And that situation exists in a way spread across large sections of the UK. So that brings you to the question of how do we, if at the global level, we've got major issues, a polycrisis, I call it, and at the local level, we've got a situation of severe difficulty for layers of working people and their families, not only in the UK, but across the world, leaving aside the question of the so-called global south, all those countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where the situation, as I said, nearly 4 billion people are living on virtually nothing in order to survive. So how is that situation going to be changed when at the same time, there's no option, no alternative being offered to solve these issues by leaders of our labour movement such as they exist in the global north and elsewhere. Everywhere, the leaders of the labour movement, whether the trade union leaders or the leaders of the social democratic parties in Europe or the Labour Party here in the UK, offer us nothing but a continuation of what we've got now. No wonder, as a number of comrades have mentioned, we see the rise of these semi-fascist or fascist groups because people don't see any other alternative. They have, and Trump, for that matter, represents this idea that I'm going to radically change, sort this out. I'm going to do some deals, and we're going to forget all this rubbish about climate change and regulating business and providing a decent public sector services. We're going to let the private sector do it. As he said, you know, all the people he's sacking at the moment from the federal government, they go out and get a job in the private sector. You'll do better there. Well, Nora can tell you that that's not the case. They're not going to do better there. They're going to do worse, if anything. So how do we change that around? Well, that's the big question, isn't it? All these discussions. I don't know how many times I've been on these sorts of discussions, and I'm sure you have too. And it usually comes down to what are we going to do about it and how are we going to organize? And we're struggling to find a way to do that. I mean, trade union movements are weak, but nevertheless, within the wider working class, there are movements. There are new industries where workers are coming to organize on the level of, in some of these industries like Amazon and elsewhere, we've seen development of new sectors of workers organizing, but also lots of young people, Nora, do participate in struggles. They're against the war. They're against the genocide in Israel. They demonstrate. They've been against climate change with big demonstrations over the years. It hasn't led to any changes, of course, but that's not the point. I still feel that there is a degree of powerful element and sentiment amongst young people in particular that we're not going to put up with this. Why should our future be like it is at the moment? We need to change that. And it only would take a spark of some decent organization that we can develop, whether it's in one country or internationally, that could change that picture. We're all in this particular Zoom are all in favor of trying to organize to do that. But we mustn't fall into the trap of saying, well, it's all hopeless and the fascists are going to take over. I don't accept that. I think we can still have an opportunity to change that. And as the situation intensifies and some of these issues get worse, then I expect and we'll see certain explosions, which will allow us the opportunity to present the alternative.
Well, thank you, Michael. Very good. Are there any colleagues who want to come back now? This still leaves thousands of aspects of the crisis to discuss. Yes, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a shot at the AI issue and hope and stay off China if I can.
Okay, yeah,
That's okay.
You know,
thanks.
it's hard not to, because they've been able to push so much state funding into working around the Biden Chips Act, and to
Yeah.
the stacking of the chips in the Huawei phone, and the outpacing of the other AIs, the workaround, because they don't want they blocking ASML and the other chip deals. Anyway,
I'll be reading your paper, don't worry.
yeah, I know. I don't know if that part's in there, but the question Dominic raises about AI, and I think all working, and this can lead to our question of our program, and how we intervene and fight for independent working class action is yeah, like Steve said, they have the Waymo, they throw all these chips at the cars, and a lot of the transportation sector. They're going to throw these chips at the cranes at the ports and drive out the port workers. It might take time. They'll throw the chips at the mining equipment and throw out the mining workers. Like you say, it might take time, but I think the capitalist class, and I have a kind of a capitalist cousin who tells me, well, this crisis of population, in 100 years, 150 years, the population will be down, and so maybe Musk's trip to Mars isn't really a trip to Mars. It's a question of how to terraform their escape pods here on the planet Earth. It's kind of like that Oz, that movie with Sean Penn, well, not Sean Penn, the other Sean, the British one, years ago, Oz something. But in terms of that, coming back to our program and something to offer, those whole layers of the left that won't fight to break from the various capitalist and imperialist parties in the United States, in terms of and even your Labor Party over there acts as a force for imperialism. We have to go to the working class and fight for independent working class political action as a counter to use this new technology to show, and we can fight for shortening the work week and using the AI to improve our conditions, only if it's in our hands. It won't be used in our hands if we don't take power. And the capitalists are happy, like the comrade said, to use genocide and fascism, to deplete the world population and let the 4 billion who can't survive starve. It's been all laid out here today, that you call it a polycrisis, terminal crisis, and of the dead stop or the abyss, whatever you're going to call it. This is what's facing us every day. And in Yorkshire, we have hundreds of similar Yorkshires in the United States, and because the left isn't there and all the Democrats are able to do is administer the crisis, it's driving people into the fascist base. And to fight that, yes, we need to fight for political independence in the trade unions. We need to organize left caucuses that fight to break from the Democrats and use class struggle methods, and that takes cadre organizations to fight, not just for a mass workers' party, but for the program of the mass workers' party. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, very good, Charles. I think most of us would fully endorse that. Themos and then Aman.
Yes, I think that always difficult to keep China out of the discussion on this and what's happening there. the last comments of Michael Roberts have made it at least possible to do that, because what impressed me in that was the stress on the irrationality of the ruling class. That's very important, because what the politics of the ruling class today is, it cannot be simply explained from a rational approach to their economic strength and their economic interests. We've gone beyond that. It's out of their hands in some way. It's not possible to see how they can bring their act together. And it's in my understanding, this is because we are moving away from the normal working mode of capitalism, and the exploitation of workers and the extraction of profit through the appropriation of surplus value. That's normal capitalism. That's what made capitalism such a viable system. But today we see the huge monopolies no more base their profits on that. Their profits is based on arbitrary appropriation of value, not only surplus value, but how they can steal from the rest of the capitalist the value out there. So this is a very unstable situation, and that, in my understanding, explains why we are living such an unstable situation the world over. Why we have wars and probably revolutions, because we have seen revolutionary movements as well. And why we are living again in what Lenin described as imperialism. Having in front of us this, and these clashes coming so fast, it seems to me that the economy has done what it could do to damage capitalism, to bring capitalism to an existential crisis. And from our job now, I think, is more on the political level, and how politically we are going to fight this, and how politically we are going to organize the class and win the class struggle that is taking place in front of us in the next period. It's not only the economic level that we are going to fight. It's what Michael has described. He described how capitalism is going inexorably into this crisis, and it cannot get out of it that easy. So it's up to the working class and up to us to find ways of waging this struggle, how to defend what we have gained in all these decades after the Second World War, and we are losing it one after the other, and how to go further. And I think the only way that can save the planet is not some individual individual struggle, but go the whole way. Economy has created the huge monopolies. We have to take these monopolies over. Can we do that? If we can, we might save a lot of things. If we cannot do that, these instabilities, wars, and destruction will continue until something else emerges, which it could be fascist, but it could also, I think, if we can pull our act together, we could probably take the big monopolies, the big corporations, the Amazons and the energy companies and the big pharma and all this. It's just a tiny proportion of of the world's population that we are going to antagonize with that. And we could go through that, and we could find in the millions and billions of workers, and not only workers, but all the dispossessed and people who are going to be dispossessed. We could find our allies there, and we should start thinking, I think, outside the normal way of capitalism and how to do this and that and that. We are out of that by now.
Again, very good. Thank you, Thomas. Absolutely. I think Aman, I think we'll have to say that Aman is the last speaker because we're getting towards the limit, and we have to give Michael a chance to make some more.
No pressure at all.
So carry on, Aman.
No, just a quick point. I think one issue was raised that how could AI help? I think that's worth answering. Perhaps it might be a repetition of what some other comrade says. What does the capitalist do? It is generally referred to as a way that they would ensure that the necessary means of living could be done in a shorter period of time. With the use of technology, they reduce the length of time that it takes to pay for what we necessarily need, something which even less than that comes to wages. So effectively, by more and more technology, instead of taking 2 hours to produce what is required to maintain a minimum means of living, they do it in 10 minutes. So the capitalist has more surplus value from that point of view. So from that way, it's generally referred to as relative surplus rather than extension of the day as the absolute surplus. That's why technology comes in. I think one thing which I would like just to add on this with regard to technology is that we can't be like the old workers who used to think the machines or a steam machine are against them and go and smash them. Part of the left, I think, is saying that, oh, AI is coming, therefore they stand against it. You can't stop that. You can't stop the technology. The question is not to stop AI. The question is, soon as that AI comes in, soon as technology improves, soon as the internet revolution took place, our slogan was shorter working week. That's definitely the answer. We can't still be talking about 40, 35, etc. The capitalists now are talking about 4 days a week. So therefore, our slogan should move to a 4-day week, 24 hours a day. 24 hours a week, 20 hours a week. Every 5 years, with the advancement of technology, working week should go shorter. That's what everybody understands and what everybody recognizes. And I think there is also one other point which I'd like to say. I don't mean it to mean as sort of something to find hope, but I think that the world, across the world, the working class of today compared to the working class of 1950 is immensely more powerful and is very, very different. If we don't have the scenario where people had to fight for effectively having ability to read and write, this has moved on. There are large sections of working class that considers the previous defeats as defeats of previous generations. They don't associate with that. They see it differently. They move forward differently. They do not accept previous defeats, and they treasure a lot of previous advances and gains. So they are moving far ahead. I just give you one example to say what I mean. For example, in Iran, where I am, the working class today says, we went to a revolution in 79, we were defeated. But that's not our generation. There could have been hundreds of different reasons why they failed. Today, we have got different situations, we've got different scenarios, we've got different abilities, we've got different expectations, and the world being grown together so much as a global village, the expectations are not the same as what it was before. It's no longer the case that anything moves on. They just decided to put a few pennies on the use of WhatsApp in Lebanon, and there was street protests all over the place because it's expected. It's part of expectation of the life. So in a way, capitalism, by actually going up much more further, by globalizing in a way, the demands of the working class across the world, the expectations are getting closer as well. So our force is not becoming less. In a way, I think we are becoming a lot stronger from that point of view. And another advantage, we don't have to fight. We don't have to say, oh, there are Stalinists now. That's gone. That's history to many of the new generations of workers. They recognize what has passed is past. They're looking for answers of today. Hence, there is more opening for the left. There is more opening in terms of the socialist stratas. There are more issues that are common across the world. And there are more hopes that this could change and this could be changed. And I think that is something to be banked on to a large extent. Sorry, thank you.
Very, very good summing up of the issue. I do say that, I mean, a new era has begun. It's very clear from the attitude and the policy and the strategy of the ruling class. We can see it with all its horror in front of our eyes. But that new era also will affect and has already begun to affect the outlook and the capacity to struggle of the working class too. And I don't feel, well, the issues are absolutely crucial, but I don't feel any pessimism about the ability of the working class to respond to the new situation and to find a way to defeat the ruling class. I think this discussion has been very useful. It's not only, we don't discuss simply for academic purposes, but in order to sharpen our ability to intervene in the class struggle and to provide a program and a way out for the working class. And I think this discussion being one of the best that I can remember of Win. So, Michael, over to you again. You're
It's difficult to follow everybody else because some people have summed up, Aman summed up many of the very good points, and previous speakers have also done. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time repeating the very good points that they've already made. Simply to make one point, what I think everybody I can see would agree is that what we're looking to, we believe and we recognize there exists a working class in our countries in the world. People who have to work for a living and people who don't own the means of production and don't control things by that method. The working class is key to changing our society and ending this poly crisis and avoiding the dangerous slip into irrational disaster which lies ahead. It's up to the working class has that power to do that. It's the class that can combine together. And that's to add that in a more specific sense. There's quite a lot of talk in the labor movement anyway here or amongst academics, as Nora would say, about we have to rely on, as it were, a bloc that's against the US, the BRICS, a multipolar bloc, a group of countries that are going to resist the position of US imperialism. My view is that that's an incorrect way to see where we're going forward. We have to look to the class in all these countries, not just those in the United States or in Europe or in the global north, but also in the countries in the so-called BRICS bloc and the other powers that resist the position of US imperialism. We have a struggle going on, but the only way that's going to end without the disasters which polycrisis shows us are happening is through turning towards an international class solidarity. Working class have got to take power in all these countries and establish workers' democracy, which can link together in international cooperation. Without that, the world remains in a disastrous position. And I'll sum it up on saying that time is running out. Time's running out for me. I'm getting old. But time is running out even for young people, unless we can do something in the next generation, perhaps even shorter, to avoid the disaster ahead.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Been a great discussion, and I hope you'll come back soon and we can continue it. For next week, we talked a little about the effect of the Trump era on world politics and the world economy, we haven't really given much attention to the question of perspectives for the USA itself. And I'm glad there's a few comrades here from the USA. You're very welcome to come back and to contribute more fully next week. The discussion will be led off by the veteran Marxist Jack Gerson, who's been several times before. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Okay, thanks very much, comrades, and goodbye.
Bye, comrade.